I taught the literacy lesson in a middle school reading interventionist classroom. While my mentor teacher teaches all 3 grades, I decided to teach her 6th graders. The students are all struggling readers with specific needs in English language arts. There are more ESL students in my mentor teacher's 5th period than in her 0 period. Because my mentor teacher is a reading interventionist, I didn't want to go too far from her current lesson plan. She's meant to help students who need it, and I didn't want to throw a wrench in her plan by teaching something they didn't need. My mentor teacher also doesn't entirely have a set curriculum. Instead, she teaches whatever the English language arts teachers are teaching at that moment. Therefore, she gave me 2 days to teach similar lessons, all having to do with pre-vocabulary and Freyer models. She asked me to teach both of her 6th grade periods on those days as opposed to one. Since the 11th of November is Veterans Day, the vocabulary centered on the short story America's White Table. Before that, I had to give some context on Veterans Day. Using the resources my mentor teacher provided me, I told students about the history of Veterans Day and how the name came to be. The 18th of November centered on vocabulary for the short story Alone in the Woods. Before that, my mentor teacher and I engaged the students in a pre-reading discussion by having them answer the prompt asking whether or not they could survive alone in the woods. I also had them infer what is happening in a picture and a part of the text. The picture was a picture of someone who seemed alone and lost in the woods, and the students had to figure out what was going on in the picture and how someone would feel in that situation. The text was from a part of the short story Alone in the Woods, and they had to basically use context clues to figure out what was happening and how the main character was feeling. After I had done the pre-work, my mentor teacher and I put students in groups of 2 to 3. From there, I let them pick the word they wanted to work on. It was on a first-come, first-served basis. For instance, if someone took the vocabulary word stag, no one could use stag but that group. When teaching, I did my best to stay upbeat and engaged for both days that I taught. Students listen the most when the teacher is engaged and seems interested in what is being taught. I taught in my mentor teacher's classroom, which is a quiet and calm area for students to learn. The main materials that were used to teach the lesson were my mentor teacher's PowerPoints and the students' Chromebooks. On November 18th, the students also got a handout with the definitions of the vocabulary words to refer to. The students were mostly engaged with the lesson, although in later periods they would not talk to each other. Sometimes would not talk to each other during group work. This is something that I should have been on a better lookout for. I also found myself calling on the same handful of students as well. Therefore, this shows that while there was participation, not every student was participating. During my last period of teaching, I asked my mentor teacher to analyze my strengths and weaknesses. One thing that I need to get better at is to call on the kids who aren't raising their hands. This is especially important because all kids need to participate, not just the ones who are actively trying to do so. Another thing that I need to work on is to check on groups who aren't talking. This is something I should have done, especially since not everyone was talking and participating. A final thing that I need to work on is timing. During 5th period on the 18th of November, I accidentally started before the bell. This was because of nervousness. Timing is especially important when you are a teacher. This is something that could have been easily prevented if I had listened to the bell. However, I didn't, and as a result, the lesson went by slightly faster than it should have. It resulted in us wrapping up a minute early, which resulted in empty time that could have been used for teaching. One thing my mentor teacher said I did well was giving good examples. When a kid didn't know what similes were, I gave him some examples of similes. I said that similes were 2 words that meant the same thing. For example, I cited the examples of soaked and drenched being synonyms. One personal thing that I thought I did well was encouraging kids to present. Although it may not always be a good idea to have struggling readers present, having kids present what they found is a good way to help them overcome the fear of public speaking that so many of us have. Final thing that I thought I did well was encouraging student engagement. Although not every student comprehended the lesson, I can at least say that I held their attention. One thing I would do differently is call on everyone. As mentioned before, this was something I could have done better. Another thing that I would do differently is center this lesson more on vocabulary. I was working with lessons that my mentor teacher provided me, but some students still didn't completely understand the vocabulary. Final thing that I would have done differently is to have them read the text before they do the FAIR models. Although I was working with my mentor teacher's already established lesson, I believe the students would have benefited from reading the text first. Another thing that I did well was listening to student input. While students were speaking, I never made them feel small due to their answers. For example, a student was off track during the 5th period of November 18th and needed more intervention. I reassured him that it was okay to make mistakes and he was still learning. If I were to teach this lesson again, I would have the students read the text and do the FAIR models rather than reading together. The students did some discussion activities. This is a good way to get them to start thinking about the short story, but doesn't entirely center on vocabulary. There was only one on-the-spot change that I made. I was originally going to have them do one of the FAIR models with me, but my mentor teacher had completed those first FAIR models. Because of this, I had them read what was already there. On November 18th during 5th period, I encouraged the students I called on to give me some of their own examples. The main thing I learned about myself is that I still have more to learn when teaching higher needs students. I thought I had it down since I've been working with my mentor teacher for a little under a year. However, I realized that my method of teaching still isn't perfect for teaching higher needs students, and I need to work on making my teaching accessible. I learned that students who struggle with reading need a lot of support. Oftentimes, students confuse examples with non-examples. Others had non-examples that didn't fit non-examples. I also learned that teaching requires students to do something that they may feel uncomfortable with. I noticed that while I was teaching, not every student liked to present. However, presenting is a skill that they are going to need when they become an adult. For example, jobs. I'll use what I learned to improve my skills in teaching struggling readers. While it's easy to remember that they need extra support, it's also easy to forget that in the heat of the moment. I'll also use my newfound knowledge to be more mindful of how I teach concepts. Sometimes it's easy to teach something as if you are teaching a regular class. However, doing the smaller things such as providing extra support can make a huge difference for the students who need it. Vocabulary is essential for building narrative organizational skills, which is referenced by Haleman et al. In the textbook. The words I introduced to the students were mostly Tier 2. The textbook states that and these vocabulary words were also picked up by my mentor teacher. The textbook states that teachers should use Tier 2 words so that students begin to own them, or basically just use them in their daily lives. The words picked also were words that would appear in the story, such as underbrush and stag. This is something that is advised by the textbooks, because after all, you want to pick words that will be relevant to the student, to what the students are reading. However, these words will also be used in the students' lives. They are more likely to hear words such as ravine, stag, underbrush, and rations in other settings. For example, a summer camp or when they're hiking may be one such scenario. The artifacts I have here are examples of FAIR models that were done by the groups of students. One example is of a FAIR model done well. One example is of a FAIR model that needed intervention from my mentor teacher and I. And the last artifact were the edits that my mentor teacher made at her desk while I taught up front. The first example is from a FAIR model on the word ravine. As one can see in the screenshot, the student provided adequate examples, non-examples, and characteristics from the definition they were given. The examples that they have were a steep cliff, a steep slide, and a steep slope. The non-examples that they had were blockages, occlusions, and barriers, and the characteristics that they put were similar to a canyon or a valley with steep slides but smaller. This shows that these students gained a better understanding of this vocabulary word outside of the definition. The second example is from a Frere model on the word stag. As one can see in the before screenshot, the student mischaracterized non-examples as examples. For example, the students put a young deer and a young stallion and a young adult male domestic chicken or turkey as examples, even though they were not. This shows that the students hadn't fully grasped the word just yet, and it needed intervention from my mentor teacher and I. This artifact is the edits that my mentor teacher made at our desk. As you can see here, the examples are properly labeled as a buck or a doe, and the non-examples were properly labeled as a chicken, turkey, or fawn. All of these artifacts show that while some students knew what to do in terms of vocabulary and Frere models, others were still struggling. Some students gained a better understanding of the vocabulary words while others struggled, and some students could understand the word past the definition while the others were not able to. I would use this information from the artifacts to target specific words to pay more attention to when we start reading the story. For instance, if students were struggling more with the word ravine, I would spend more time on it as we were reading. The same would go for any other word that they would struggle with.